Good morning, guys. I hope you enjoyed, because of Winn Dixie yesterday, I'm going to read chapter 3, chapter 4, and chapter 5 today. We're going to go ahead and read 3 chapters and try to get through some of this. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Chapter 3. I started in on Winn Dixie right away, trying to clean him up. First, I gave him a bath. I used the garden hose and some baby shampoo. He stood still for it, but I could tell he didn't like it. He looked insulted, and the whole time, he didn't show me his teeth or wag his tail once. After he was all washed and dried, I brushed him good. I used my own hairbrush and worked real hard at all the knots and patches of fur stuck together. He didn't mind being brushed. He wiggled his tail like it felt pretty good. The whole time I was working on him, I was talking to him, and he listened. I told him how we were alike. "See," I said, "you don't have any family, and neither do I. I've got the preacher, of course, but I don't have a mama. I have one, but I don't know where she is. She left when I was 3 years old. I can't hardly remember her, and I bet you don't remember your mama much either. So we're almost like orphans." Winn Dixie looked straight at me when I said that to him, like he was feeling relieved to finally have somebody to understand his situation. I nodded my head at him and went on talking. "I don't even have any friends because I had to leave them all behind when we moved here from Watley. Watley's up in North Florida. Have you ever been to North Florida?" When Dixie looked down at the ground like he was trying to remember if he had. "You know what?" I said. "Ever since we moved here, I've been thinking about my mama extra hard, more than I ever did when I was in Watley." Winn Dixie twitched his ears and raised his eyebrows. "I think the preacher thinks about my mama all the time, too. He still loves her. I know that because I heard the ladies at the church in Watley talking about him. They said he's still hoping she'll come back, but he doesn't tell me that. He won't talk to me about her much at all. I want to know more about her, but I'm afraid to ask the preacher. I'm afraid he's going to get mad at me." Winn Dixie looked at me hard, like he was trying to say something. "What?" I said, and he stared at me. "You think I should make the preacher tell me about her?" Winn Dixie looked at me so hard, he sneezed. "I'll think about it," I said. When I was done working with him, Winn Dixie looked a whole lot better. He still had some bald spots, but the fur he did have cleaned up nice. It was all shiny and soft. You could still see his ribs, but I intended to feed him good, and that would take care of that. I couldn't do anything about his crooked yellow teeth because he got into a sneezing fit every time I started brushing them with my toothbrush, and I finally had to give up. But for the most part, he looked a whole lot better, and so I took him into the trailer and showed him to the preacher. "Daddy," I said. He was working on a sermon and kind of muttering to himself. "Daddy, I wanted to show you the new Winn Dixie." The preacher put down his pencil and rubbed his nose, and finally he looked up. "Well," he said, smiling real big at Winn Dixie. "Well now, don't you look handsome?" Winn Dixie smiled back at the preacher. He went over and put his head on the preacher's lap. "He smells nice too," said the preacher. He rubbed Winn Dixie's head and looked into his eyes. "Daddy," I said, real quick before I lost all my nerve, "I've been talking to Winn Dixie." "Is that right?" said the preacher, and he scratched Winn Dixie's head. "I've been talking to him, and he agreed with me that since I'm 10 years old, you should tell me 10 things about my mama. Just 10, that's all." The preacher stopped rubbing Winn Dixie's head and held real still. I could see him thinking about pulling his head back into a shell. "One thing for every year I've been alive," I told him. "Please?" Winn Dixie looked up at his preacher and kind of gave him a nudge with his nose. The preacher sighed. He said to Winn Dixie, "I should have guessed you were going to be trouble." Then he looked at me. "Come on, Opal," he said. "Sit down, and I will give you 10 things about your mama." Chapter 4. "1," said the preacher. We were sitting on the couch, and Winn Dixie was sitting between us. Winn Dixie had already decided that he liked the couch a lot. "1," said the preacher again. "Your mama was funny. She could make just about anybody laugh." "2," he said. "She had red hair and freckles." "Just like me," I said. "Just like you," the preacher nodded. 3, she liked to plant things. She had a talent for it. She could stick a tire in the ground and grow a car. Winn Dixie started chewing on his paw, and I tapped him on the head to make him stop. 4, said the preacher. She could run fast. If you were racing her, you couldn't have ever let her get a head start because she would have beat you for sure. I'm that way too, I said. Back home in Wally, I raced Liam Fullerton and beat him, and he said it wasn't fair because boys and girls shouldn't race each other to begin with. I told him he was just a sore loser. The preacher nodded. Sorry, guys. Sorry. Where was I? The preacher nodded. He was quiet for a minute. I'm ready for number 5, I told him. 5, he said. She shouldn't cook. She burned everything, including water. She had a hard time opening a can of beans. She couldn't make head nor tail of a piece of meat. 6. The preacher rubbed his nose and looked at the ceiling. Number 6 is that your mama loved a story. She would sit and listen to stories all day long. She loved to be told a story. She especially liked funny ones. Stories that made her laugh. The preacher nodded his head like he was agreeing with himself. What's number 7, I asked. Let's see, he said. She knew all the constellations, every planet in the nighttime sky. Every one of them. She could name them and point them out, and she never got tired of looking at them. Number 8, said the preacher, was that she hated being a preacher's wife. She said she couldn't stand having the ladies at church judge what she was wearing and what she was cooking and how she was singing. She said it made her feel like a bug under a microscope. When Dixie lay down on the couch, he put his nose in the preacher's lap and his tail in mine. 10, said the preacher. 9, I told him. 9, said the preacher. She drank, and sometimes she couldn't stop, and that made me and your mama fight quite a bit. Number 10. Number 10 is that your mama loved you. She loved you very much. But she left me, I told him. She left us, said the preacher softly. I could see him pulling his old head back into the turtle shell, into that stupid shell. She packed her bags and left us, and she didn't leave one thing behind. Okay, I said. I got up off the couch when Dixie hopped off too. Thank you for telling me, I said. I went right back to my room and wrote down all 10 things that the preacher told me. I wrote them down just the way he had said them to me so that I wouldn't forget them, and then I read them out loud to Winn Dixie until I had them memorized. I wanted to know those 10 things inside and out. That way, if my mama ever did come back, I could recognize her, and I would be able to grab her and hold on to her tight and not let her get away from me ever again. Chapter 5. Winn Dixie couldn't stand to be left alone. We found that out real quick. If me and the preacher went off and left him by himself in the trailer, he pulled all the cushions off the couch and all the toilet paper off the roll. So we started tying him up outside with the rope when we left. Well, that didn't work either. When Dixie howled until Samuel, Mrs. Detweller's dog, started howling too. It was exactly the kind of noise that people in an all-adult trailer park did not like to hear. He just doesn't want to be left alone, I told the preacher. That's all. Let's take him with us. I could understand the way when Dixie felt. Getting left behind probably made his heart feel empty. After a while, the preacher gave in, and everywhere we went, we took Winn Dixie with us, even to church. The Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi isn't a regular-looking church. The building used to be a Pick It Quick store, and when you walk in the front door, the first thing you see is the Pick It Quick motto. It's written on the floor in little tiny red letters that make the great big letters that say, pick, 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 quick, quick, quick. The preacher tried painting over those tiles, but the letters won't stay covered up, and so the preacher just gave up and let them be. The other thing about the Open Arms that is different from other churches is there aren't any pews. People bring their own fold-up chairs and lawn chairs, and so sometimes it looks more like the congregation is watching a parade or sitting at a barbecue instead of being at church. It's kind of a strange church, I thought, when Dixie might fit in. But the first time we brought Winn Dixie to the Open Arms, the preacher tied him up outside the front door. Why did we bring him all the way here just to tie him up? I asked the preacher. Because dogs don't belong in church, Opal. That's why, he said. He tied Winn Dixie up to a tree and said how there was lots of shade for him and that it ought to work out real good. Well, it didn't. The service started and there was some singing and some sharing and some praying. And then the preacher started preaching. And he wasn't but 2 or 3 words into his sermon when the terrible howl came from outside. The preacher tried to ignore it. Today, he said. "Ow!" said Winn Dixie. "Please," said the preacher. "Ow!" said Winn-Dixie back. Friends, said the preacher. Arr, wailed Winn-Dixie. Everyone turned in their lawn chairs and fold-up chairs and looked at one another. Opal, said the preacher. Oh, said Winn-Dixie. Yes, sir, I said. Go get that dog, he yelled. Yes, sir, I yelled back. I went outside and untied Winn-Dixie and brought him inside, and he sat down beside me and smiled up at the preacher, and the preacher couldn't help it. He smiled back. Winn-Dixie had that effect on him. And so the preacher started in preaching again. Winn-Dixie sat there listening to it, wiggling his ears the way and that way, trying to catch all the words, and everything would have been all right except that a mouse ran across the floor. The open arms had mice. They were there from when it was a Picket Quick, and there were lots of good things to eat in the building. And when the Picket Quick became the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi, the mice stayed around to eat all the leftover crumbs from the potluck suppers. The preacher kept on saying he was going to have to do something about them, but he never did. Because the truth is, he can stand the thought of hurting anything, even a mouse. Well, Winn-Dixie saw that mouse, and he was up and after him. 1 minute, everything was quiet and serious, and the preacher was going on and on and on, and the next minute, Winn-Dixie looked like a furry bullet shooting across the building, chasing that mouse. He was barking, and his feet were skidding all over the polished Picket Quick floor, and people were clapping and hollering and pointing. They were really wild when Winn-Dixie actually caught that mouse. I have never in my life seen a dog catch a mouse, said Mrs. Nordley. She was sitting next to me. He's a special dog, I told her. I imagine so, she said back. Winn-Dixie stood there in front of the whole church, wagging his tail and holding the mouse real carefully in his mouth, holding on to him tight, but not squishing him. I believe that mutt has got some retriever in him, said somebody behind me. That's a hunting dog. Winn-Dixie took the mouse over to the preacher and dropped it at his feet, and when the mouse tried to get away, Winn-Dixie put his paw right on the mouse's tail. Then he smiled up at the preacher. He showed him all of his teeth. The preacher looked down at the mouse. He looked at Winn-Dixie. He looked at me. He rubbed his nose. It got real quiet in the Picket Quick. Let us pray, the preacher finally said, for this mouse. And everybody started laughing and clapping. The preacher picked up the mouse and by the tail and walked and threw it out the front door of the Picket Quick, and everybody applauded again. Then he came back, and we all prayed together. I prayed for my mama. I told God how much she would have enjoyed hearing the story of Winn-Dixie catching that mouse. It would have made her laugh. I asked God if maybe I could be the one to hear that story someday. And then I talked to God about how I was lonely in Naomi because I didn't know that many kids, only the ones from church. And there weren't that many kids at the Open Arms, just Dunlap and Stevie Dewberry, two brothers who weren't twins but kind of looked like they were. And Amanda Wilkinson, whose face was always pinched up like she was smelling something really bad. And Sweetie Pie Thomas, who was only 5 years old and still mostly a baby. And none of them wanted to be my friend anyways, because they probably thought I'd tell on them to the preacher for every little thing they did wrong. And then they would get in trouble with God and their parents. So I told God that I was lonely, even having Winn-Dixie. And finally, I prayed for the mouse, like the preacher suggested. I prayed that he didn't get hurt when he went flying out the door of the Open Arms Baptist Church in Naomi. I prayed that he landed on a nice, soft patch of grass. And that is the end of the chapter. So tomorrow we'll read some more. Hope you guys have a good day. Bye.